All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and let our expert panelists introduce themselves. So my name is Maddie Regis. I'm going to be the moderator today. I am the marketing content coordinator for NetGain Technologies, and I'm going to go ahead and throw it over to Dustin first to introduce himself.
Hey everyone, my name is Dustin Nichols. I'm a consulting systems engineer with NetGain Technologies. I look forward to talking to you today about how we can help improve your disaster recovery solution.
Great, thanks so much, Dustin. Andy?
Thank you. Andy Fernandez. I'm a senior product marketing manager here at Zerto. We're a cloud data management and protection platform, and happy to be here.
Thanks so much. Jack?
Hey, glad to be on with you all. My name is Jack Bailey. I'm Director of Enablement here at iLand, and I represent one of the best cloud service providers in the world for data protection. Can't wait to chat with you today about meeting some of your needs.
All right, awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining us and sharing your expertise today. So I'm going to jump right in with our first question, which is already up on the screen, which is I think something a lot of organizations are thinking about, which is what are the risks for my data and what are the impacts for my business? And I'm going to go ahead and throw that over to Andy first.
Yeah, absolutely. I think something that we all know is that data is growing, but so is its criticality and its importance to revenue. So when we look at a quantifiable way of understanding the cost of disruption, both planned and unplanned to the business, this data actually comes from IDC, who performed a survey from SMBs to enterprise IT pros all over the world. And they found that the average cost of downtime per hour across all industries was $250,000 an hour. So if you look at the average collective 8 hours of downtime, that's $2 million. That is a direct financial impact on not being able to recover and restore data in time. But I know Jack has a lot more information on maybe some of the more qualitative issues that we're seeing with downtime and disruption.
Yeah, so great points, Andy. I think what's on everyone's mind, right? We get to talk to thousands of end users and customers each year, and by and large, ransomware is up at the top of the list. We'll talk a little bit more about that and how to recover from it later. But year over year, 400% growth of reported attacks, many that probably go unreported as well. Accidental deletion, believe it or not, 40% of industries still report that. But probably the biggest statistic in the past year that's grown the fastest is insider attacks and issues. And you think about it, right? The headlines are normally somebody gets fired, they delete a bunch of things, but we're all working from home. I have 2 young kids. People are more distracted than ever, and they can click on things, do things that they normally wouldn't, and people get access to credentials. So all, unfortunately, threats that are growing, and a really good reason to have the conversation today.
Definitely. And with that, kind of the discussion about backup and disaster recovery, I'm going to go ahead and throw up a poll here for our audience. So what is your approach to disaster recovery today? Got a couple of options on the screen there. We'll just give everyone a second to answer that. Jack, is there any particular predictions you have? What do you think it's going to be tending towards? Cloud, a DIY second site, backup as disaster recovery?
You know, it's different with every honest, but we definitely see a tendency to have organizations that try to blend a bit of both together, both the DR and backup piece. But we'll talk some good reasons about that in a moment, and happy to jump into that whenever you'd like, Maddie.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we'll just close our poll out here, and it looks like backup as DR is the most common for our audience today. So good to know. That helps inform the conversation as we move forward.
Yeah, so, absolutely.
Yeah, Jack, I'll go ahead and throw this next question to you. Go ahead.
Yeah, not too surprising. We see that quite a bit. And it's a question that I get phrased maybe a little differently of, do I need both, right? And my answer is almost always yes, right? To me, backup and DR serve very important components within an infrastructure, but very different ones. To me, backup has traditionally been more around long-term retention, granular file folder recovery back to the original location, whereas DR is built in a way where it's just that. It's recovered from a disaster. The original location, the original app, the original data is no longer there. So recovery to that data is really critical to do so in a very expedited and flexible way. But Andy, I know you can walk us through that a little bit more with some of your visuals here.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's well put, right? There's a big difference between restoring a file that was deleted to production than failing over an entire site, whether it's because of a hurricane, an outage, hardware failures. And one of the interesting ones that we'll continue talking about is ransomware is kind of a fringe case where it could be DR, it could be backup, it could be both. It's really what gives you the best ability to recover, but also the severity and scope of the encryption that happened. But to hone in on backup a little bit and why it's not suitable for a DR use case, if you just think about the technology, backup, it uses snapshots. It's been around for 30, 40 years, and you take a copy of that data. Usually you only do it once a day because of the impact on production, right? So just think of what that does in the scenario of a disaster. On the other hand, you have DR technology that includes replication. Replication is essentially replicating every couple of seconds to another warm site. That way you have the ability to select thousands of recovery points. So let's use a specific incident that you get something where you have to recover and it's 4 p.m. Well, guess what? Using a backup technology, even if that backup restore is successful, you've inherently still lost data just because of the technology and how it works, right? So thinking about your VMs, your Commvaults, really those are backup technologies. Zerto delivers an ability to replicate this data. So it's an RPO conversation. But RTO is really important too, especially when you talk about in these scenarios, how long it takes your IT staff to do something is very important. So if we move to the next slide, one of the things that we pride ourselves in, not just delivering RPO of seconds, which is what you need for DR. Think of what you're protecting with DR. It's your tier 1, tier 2 most critical applications, the crown jewel of your environment. With Zerto, within one user interface, just in a couple of steps, you're able to fail over an entire site. You can also recover an entire application consistently, but from a DR perspective, you're able to fail over to secondary site, you're able to fail over to a service provider, and that's what's most important. Not only reducing the data loss, but also making sure that it takes a lot less time so you can actually focus on building your business and not maintaining it.
Absolutely. And I think this is another question that I'm sure you all get a lot, which is, why should I consider a disaster recovery as a service versus a do-it-yourself solution? And I'll go ahead and have Andy kind of continue his talking points and take this one first.
Yeah, and as the technology itself that iLand utilizes apart from its service catalog, we encounter customers who are asking us, should we use the public cloud? Should we build our own secondary site? Should we use disaster recovery as a service? And when we can honestly deliver that is Gartner actually does a good job of explaining the reasoning why most organizations are using DRaaS if we go to the next slide. And it's really, if you don't have the expertise to really deliver the SLAs that you need to, the training, the ability to actually develop a run book. One thing is to have a DR solution that you purchase, and the other thing is to actually have a DR practice that your team can execute on. Those are very different things, and that we see that in the survey as well. Another important one is CapEx versus OpEx. That's a big deal. The amount of time, energy, and resources it takes to maintain a secondary site, it takes a lot of time, a lot of expertise, where you're simply able to offload a lot of that responsibility to a service provider. And Jack can probably give a lot more context to that.
Yeah, definitely. And before we move on to that, would you just, Andy, for the audience who may not know, could you explain what RTO and RPO are real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. Your RPO is your recovery point objective that really talks about how much data is lost, like in time intervals. And then you have your recovery time objective, which is how long does it actually take me to recover that data? They're both equally as important and relevant, but from a DR perspective, you really need to make sure you have both. And to highlight, Zerto delivers RPOs of seconds, and you can select your RPOs as well, and then RTOs of minutes as well.
Awesome, thank you. Just wanted to have that clarification. So Jack, I'll have you continue on a conversation about disaster recovery as a service versus DIY.
Yeah, absolutely. If we go to the next slide, I can point some things out here, which is really that at the end of the day, Andy with Zerto, me from iLand, the NetGain team are in the business of protecting data, and most organizations aren't, right? So it really comes down to, as Andy mentioned, expertise and focus. So what really customers of all three of our technologies are looking to do is this. They're not looking to do DR. They're looking to reduce their risk, save money, and drive revenue. That's really it at the end of the day. Reducing risk means, as Andy just mentioned, you can recover from second-old data in a matter of minutes, right? That you have the ability to test, which is something that iLand and Zerto do really well together, to test non-disruptively, to build that confidence that it's going to work when you need it to. Saving money part is pretty straightforward, but it's shocking how DR on your own can be one of the most costly, wasteful uses of money for an organization, because there's unused capacity that frankly is either wasted because it's unused or undersized where you can't use it for recovery. And it's that double-edged sword the whole time, where you'd be much better off paying for exactly what you use. And what a perfect use case for the cloud that DR provides. On-demand access to fully performant CPU, RAM, and storage, but not paying for it when you're not using it. So at the end of the day, as we were alluding to before, your organization could focus more on what actually makes money, what actually gets you customers, because that's the whole point of all this. So relying on the expertise of the NetGain team, iLand, and Zerto to help drive all these results and letting you do business as usual. Now, if we go to the next slide, though, I can explain just a tiny bit more about why this does, in fact, save money and why this is a better fit. Zerto is a phenomenal technology, but if you're doing it yourself, at the end of the day, you would still need a mirrored site to ultimately install Zerto, have the stores, the capacity, the networking, all the things we talked about just a moment ago. The way that iLand provides the service through NetGain using Zerto at the end of the day is with an IP address, a VPN, and that's all that's required to get started. There's no additional overhead, there's no additional management or components like that. And with that, your organization gains access to everything you need to actually recover. The networking pieces, the components of it, all on demand. And Dustin, I know connectivity and end user access is so critical when it comes to DR. Do you mind speaking a little bit about where NetGain and iLand connect the dots on that side of the equation?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jack. Yeah, so what we do is we work with your business to figure out the best way to get your users connected to iLand, especially after a disaster happens. But also, while you're setting this up, you need to have the connectivity to the environment. This is where NetGain helps your business plan the network connectivity requirements and communicate with iLand and assist you with disasters when they happen.
Absolutely, and I'll chime in too, Jack, as talking about the replication, because ultimately we make a lot of assumptions, right? DR technology has been around for a while, and we think, oh yeah, a race-based replication, that means I have to build my own site, right? I have to use recover point, I need homogeneous storage, it has to be mirrored, and it can be clunky and it can be difficult to use. But with Zerto, our replication is near synchronous, meaning that it also sits at the hypervisor level, and it's a software-only install. This means that whatever infrastructure works best for you, and in today's case, we're talking about organizations that would benefit most from using a service provider. Zerto's performance doesn't waver between on-premise, public, or service provider. So really the focus is giving you the flexible replication that's modern, that's a scale-out architecture, and it's giving you those checkpoints every 5 seconds. That makes it so easy to connect to iLand.
All right, very good. Well, thank you guys for explaining all those different aspects of the setup. And so this is something that Jack alluded to earlier, which is obviously cybersecurity is super important, top of mind for everyone at this point. And so Jack, why don't you speak to the cybersecurity evolution and the requirements of protection to sort of reduce organizations' risks today with DR?
Yeah, great point, Maddie. And that's something we were talking about a moment ago. That's the whole point of the DR piece, reducing risk, reducing costs, increasing confidence, right? And as we were mentioning earlier on, risks are evolving. And what we see time and time again with many of the risks these days, certainly you still have the headlines of hurricanes and floods and other things like that, data center outages, comets hitting the earth, whatever the case may be, where the latest point in data would be an ideal point in data to recover to. But what comes up time and time again with some of these other risks of deletion, corruption, and encryption especially, is that the latest copy of the data is not necessarily the valid one. You really need to plan when you have disaster recovery and backup for that matter as well, to have flexibility with what point in time, and what Andy spoke about and we'll chat about as well with the RPO piece about how it's so critical to get close to when the event happened to reduce data loss, but still be able to go back far enough to protect from that. Andy, I think you have a visual on that though you want to walk us through.
Yeah, absolutely. And to point on that, if you think about today's threat landscape, the volume, the severity, and the sophistication of ransomware attacks is something we haven't seen before, and we're going to continue to see that. In the history of cybersecurity, the focus has really been on preventing, and it should still be a focus to have prevention, but there's now more than ever attention on recovery. And that is why at the beginning, we really honed in on the difference between backup technologies that are snapshot based versus replication to do this. Because with backup, you are subject to that daily backup. If that restore it fails, then you have to go to the previous checkpoint. You are incrementally increasing your data loss, and the RTO is high as well. With our journaling technology, right, what we're doing is we've produced thousands of recovery points for you a day. And within that, you have the flexibility to select, do I want to recover 5 seconds before encryption? Maybe I don't want to risk that. Do I want to recover a minute before encryption? You have the flexibility to do that, but you also have the testing mechanism to be able to test the integrity of that data as well, which is crucial. You don't want to roll something back to production that's already been infected. But really, it's about flexibility and the granularity of recovery, not just for a site, but also for an application level as well. And that's really where we're recommending, Accenture talks about this, with recovery within the NIST framework, it's about bend, don't break. You have to make an assumption something will get through. You need to make sure that you have the expertise and the technology to be able to recover that data.
Absolutely. I think that's something everyone should be keeping in mind for their organization at this point in time. So then kind of wrapping it all up into one nice little bow, how does all of this technology, protecting your business, the backup, the disaster recovery, how does all of this fit together? And I'm going to go ahead and throw it to Dustin first.
Thanks, Manny. Since 1984, NetGain Technologies has helped many clients when they've been hit by disaster and seen firsthand the struggles it has taken to get those clients operating again. This is why NetGain partners and recommends iLand and Zerto to help reduce the risk and loss of productivity. Jack, would you mind sharing how it all ties together?
Yeah, absolutely. Just a quick visual for you. So Dust makes a great point of how critical it is to have all three of those components come together. So the way that iLand presents this through NetGain, through the Zerto technologies, is a single interface for it all, right? Andy's mentioned before the importance of validation, the importance of being able to trigger failover at different points in time. And the iLand console is designed to say, hey, from the same interface that you manage your VMware-based environment, your failover, your networking, all these components, you can do that failover piece. If you click forward once, Maddie, what we'll see here is we mentioned that building it yourself versus using cloud can be much more costly on the do-it-yourself side. And what you'll see within the iLand console here is that you're really just paying for storage. And then when you go live, you pay for the CPU and RAM on demand. Security tools are built in, support's built in, networking components are built in, and it's really just that variation of testing, doing failover, and being as cost effective as possible. When it comes to things like networking and security, your DR site, and hopefully we're making this point clear today, there are layers of prevention, as Andy was mentioning. It's great to have a defense in depth strategy, but many cases it's not a matter of if, but when you may need to have DR, you may need to failover, you may need to recover. And so treating your DR site like a production site, treating it like it's going to be your future production site means how do end users get access to it? The connectivity that Dustin mentioned before, of sitting down and actually mapping that out, what that looks like, and then having security tools in place for when you fail over. The cloud, people like iLand, for example, top 3% of compliant cloud providers in the world, dozens of different frameworks we have to adhere to. But at the end of the day, it's another data center. So having antivirus, anti-malware, intrusion detection tools built into the platform are pretty critical for making sure that when you fail over, you're still covered. And then if we advance it forward 2 more times real quick, Maddie, to finish off the slide, it's VMware based. So at the end of the day, 85% of organizations like yours on-prem are running VMware. You already have expertise on it. This is a continuation of your site. No conversion, no real new skills to have to learn to gain value from it. And with DR, in many cases, the less changes that you and your end users have, the more likely it is to be successful overall there.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Jack. And then I think there's one more element, which is Catalyst, which I'm going to have Dustin explain.
Yeah, so the Catalyst tool allows us to kind of come into your environment and see if you're cloud ready and determine what it would take to get you up to iLand and Zerto. We'd work with you to determine what could could be hosted up there and what could, in the event of a disaster, and whether or not it would actually run when we needed it to.
Very good. Andy, you have anything to add as we kind of wrap up our conversation here?
Yeah, ultimately, I can't stress enough, right? If you're an organization that recognizes the fact that maybe we have a DR solution, or we think that backup is that DR solution, but you have greater delays that you need to meet. You have a greater protection scope that you have, but you're also seeing incidents like ransomware, and that's a serious threat, especially if you're in high criticality type of industry, right? Financial, healthcare, law enforcement, these things are really important. And so to stress that, it's really important to understand that if you have SLA requirements, if you're coming up on, you have to refresh all of your hardware. We all know the headache that drives and creates. Really take a look at two things. Take a look at the type of provider and the service catalog that they can deliver, the compliance, the customer service, but also the tool that they're using, so that you're getting the best RPOs, you're getting good RTOs, but you're also getting the support, the enablement, and really the expertise of an iLand as well.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. So we've got one more poll, which kind of relates to the wrapping up here, is just, how can we help those of you in the audience today with your technology needs? So I'm going to go ahead and launch that. And it looks like we've got a question in here, which I think is a really good one. So I'm sure you all have experienced at some point getting brought back into an organization after a cyber attack has already occurred. So what's the difference between an organization that has a disaster recovery as a service solution in place versus one that doesn't? What's been your experience with that? Jack, I guess I'll throw that to you first.
Yeah, legitimately, I had a webinar earlier today where I talked about the stat of 96% of businesses. Now, obviously, that number will probably fluctuate by the analysis and the organization that does it, but 96% of businesses that have a trusted backup and DR strategy will survive a ransomware attack or natural disaster type outage. And there's staggering stats on the other side that talk about the consequences of not. I'm not a big doom and gloom type of guy by any means, but I do think, as Andy's been stressing, and I am as well, the preparation in advance really pays off in time, for sure.
Absolutely, that makes sense. Dustin, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I've been involved in quite a few disaster situations over the years, and one of the big things is almost everybody's got backups. But one of the last ones we ran into, the client was hit by ransomware, but it ended up the attacker was able to get on to their backup server and was able to delete their backups. Unfortunately, we weren't able to recover much of the newer data, but they had data that was older that they didn't get touched, so they had to pretty much start over. I think it went back about 3 weeks. It just brings home the point to have a disaster recovery solution that you can get your RPOs or seconds and get them off site. You don't keep your backups on site. Keep them keep it set offline. Very important.
Absolutely, for sure. And I think I've got one more question here. I'm gonna throw it over to Andy because I know you talked about snapshots, but somebody's asking, can I use my snapshots as disaster recovery?
Yeah, so I think in the poll, 54% of the audience was using their snapshots for disaster recovery. But we really highlighted why that's not the best approach. And what I want to say is, and Jack and Dustin can attest to this, there is a paradoxical expectation of backup admins and DR admins where they're expected to deliver better SLAs. When I say SLAs, I mean RTOs and RPOs than ever, to support more VMs and different workloads than ever, but they're also expected to spend less time doing so. And that is an interesting thing. And so when you think about snapshots, there's two things. There's the performance, right? Because they're cumbersome, because they place a massive impact on your production environment, you're limited to taking a daily copy. And that's also an incremental copy. So you're also facing an inconsistent recovery. So that's from an RPO perspective. But then it's the management of those solutions from a snapshot perspective, right? So we have clients who have used backup before, and they were facing 45 minutes, an hour just to restore a file. And so really when you want to trust a technology like the snapshot for your ERP, for your SAP, for the most critical tier 1, tier 2, we really recommend replication for something that you truly need to keep your business running and resilient.
Definitely, that makes sense. All right, we've got one last question here, which is what prevents Zerto from being affected by ransomware? So Andy, I'll go ahead and send that one to you again.
Yeah, absolutely. So really what we deliver is a way to set up and configure your environment to avoid those issues, to avoid easily seeing, as Dustin already talked about, cyber attackers are targeting backup, they're targeting replication, they're targeting these engines and making sure they do so. But usually when we see that happens, it's because it wasn't configured correctly and they didn't have the right protocol, right? So we always ask that people follow the instructions, follow the configuration to make sure that they have that ability, but also always good to follow the 3-2-1 rule as well to make sure that you have a copy of that data to bring back as well.
Definitely. All right, well, I think that wraps up our questions here. So thank you, gentlemen, for sharing your expertise. Thanks, everyone, for participating. Have a great rest of your day.